So I feel like you can learn a lot about who a person is just based on what their favorite books are. And as I was brainstorming video ideas for how I can introduce myself here on BookTube, I thought, what better way to do it than by telling you about my favorite books of all time. Alright, real quick before we get to the books, let me give you a brief self-introduction. Hi, my name is Amanda, I'm 25 years old and I live in New York City. My favorite genres to read are fantasy, mythology, sci-fi, dark academia, and literary fiction. When I'm not reading, I can usually be found listening to film scores, binge watching my latest TV obsession, or forcing my cat to hang out with me. Now that we are somewhat acquainted, I'm going to start talking about the books, but in this video I will be talking about my favorites from my childhood, my teenage years, and my current favorites. If you're here for book recs that you could read now, feel free to skip over to my section on my current favorites. I will have everything timestamped, but if you would like to learn about the books that first made me fall in love with reading, I'd love to take you on a trip down memory lane. The Magic Tree House, an early favorite of mine, also my gateway drug into fantasy, but I just love the idea of these kids going off into the woods and being at this tree house that could just take them to any place in the world at any point in time. I thought that was the coolest thing ever, and I remember begging my parents over and over to get me this tree house, and they didn't, by the way, but I remember thinking that if I could just get a tree house, then I could also go on these adventures and I could be Jack and Annie's third sibling. There were so many of these books, and you could get these matching educational guides that go with like the chapter books. I don't actually know what they're called. I'm gonna have to look that up. Just did a very quick Google search and they were called the Fact Tracker series. There was like one on mummies, dinosaurs, pirates, knights and castles. But yeah, anyways, the series looks like it's thriving. There are so many books, which makes me happy. Hopefully it helps many other children fall in love with reading and with fantasy. The next two series I will talk about together because I feel like they are kind of in the same vein, but they were the Warrior Cats series and the Guardians of Ga'Hoole. They were essentially just Game of Thrones for cats and owls respectively, but I ate both of these series up. So I honestly can't remember like any plot details from either of these series. I think the Warrior series might still be going on today, but I just remember thinking that these were the most epic stories ever. Like these owls and these cats were battling for glory, they were battling for honor, they were battling to save their families, and I just so badly wanted to be a part of their animal societies. So it was really no surprise to me that I loved Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire because the foundation was laid many years ago with these cats and owls. Percy Jackson, another all-time favorite of mine, also where my love for mythology began. I remember reading these books as they were coming out, and I remember waiting between the Battle of the Labyrinth and the Last Olympian and being just so stressed about what was going to happen to Percy and what was going to happen to Camp Half-Blood and what was going to happen to Luke. And I think the thing that really attracted me to the series when I was first reading it was the idea of there being a home out there for kids who were misunderstood, who didn't really feel like they fit into society. I think I was really holding out hope, like I know a lot of kids were, that I would make my way to Camp Half-Blood one day. And yeah, obviously it did not happen, but I did find my home in a way in these books. These were the first characters that I really felt attached to, and when I was reading, I never really remembered that I was reading. I felt like I was there, and I just fell in love with the story and just really everything about it. And beyond the characters, I remember being fascinated by the Greek mythology aspect of it. When I get to the part of this video where I'll talk about my current favorites, you'll notice that love for mythology has very much continued into the present. Overall, this is just a story that's very near and dear to my heart. Percy was also my first book crush. I thought he was the coolest guy ever, and I think back very fondly when I think about those summer days in the suburbs just reading this book, and I'm very glad that, especially now with the Disney Plus show coming out, that it'll find its way to more readers and a new generation of audiences. And my final favorite that I'll highlight from my childhood is the Chronicles of Narnia series. If you couldn't already tell from everything else I've said in this video, I was a kid who heavily relied on escapism, and I was pretty much daydreaming 24/7. I feel like Lucy, Susan, Peter, and Edmund just had like everything I wanted in life. Like I too wanted to walk through a wardrobe and enter this fantasy world where I could be a queen and go on all these adventures. I will also say that if you at this point in time don't know how the Narnia series concludes, don't look into it. Don't look into it. As for honorable mentions, we have Island of the Blue Dolphins, Where the Red Fern Grows, which was the first book to ever break me emotionally, and The Runaway Bunny, which was my favorite picture book growing up. Another book I loved during my childhood but forgot to put in the honorable mention section was The Phantom Tollbooth. But that is all from my childhood. Now let's go on to the teenage years. Alright, before I go into my favorite books during my teen years, I feel like I have to do a little montage reel about this era because it was truly something else. The early 2010s was the peak of the dystopian craze and the era of the multi-fandom fangirl. If you were on Instagram, Facebook, or Tumblr, you would have likely come across many edits like these.
and these. And these. My maladaptive daydreaming was out of control during those years, but honestly, I was having the time of my life.
My first favorite from my teenage years is The Hunger Games. Just an incredible series that I think everybody should read. It touches on so many important themes and topics of like power and control, governmental abuse, suffering as entertainment, revolution. It's just also packaged in such like a digestible way that anybody from any background or any age can understand. So The Hunger Games is a YA dystopian trilogy. It has 3 books in the main series as well as 1 prequel. In these books, we follow Katniss Everdeen, who volunteers for her little sister when she's reaped for the 74th Hunger Games. And the Hunger Games are these games that the government holds each year where these children have to fight to the death, and they set them up as a way to kind of keep the districts in check and remind them of their power and control. So I actually read The Hunger Games the year that it was published. I was going around the library reading back covers like I used to do a lot as a kid, and I was just really intrigued by the idea of like this game and this dystopian world. And I was that really annoying kid when like the movies were coming out who would tell everybody that they weren't a true fan because they didn't read the book when it first came out. But you know what? I was a true fan, and I was waiting between books. So after I read The Hunger Games, I had to wait for Catching Fire, I had to wait for Mockingjay, and it was so painful because I just was so invested in the world, and I just really badly wanted to know what was going to happen to all these characters and what the fate of Panem was going to be. And I myself actually did dabble in adminning some of those Facebook Hunger Games fan pages. So yeah, that's where I was at in my teenage years. Also just wanted to say, I swear it's the last thing I will say about the Hunger Games series and then we can move on, but I'm so happy we got a movie adaptation of The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I guess I didn't technically read this in my teenage years because it came out in 2020, and that was many years later from the original trilogy, and there were mixed opinions about this book when it first came out. I absolutely loved it. I thought it was such an interesting way to explore the origins of the games, and also just like an interesting exploration of governmental philosophy and Snow's backstory. I thought the movie was fantastic as well, and I'm hoping Suzanne Collins writes some more books. I don't know where she is. She has like no social media presence, but I hope she is doing great because she deserves it. Another series that I loved in my teenage years was Divergent. This was another dystopian series where there were like these 5 factions, and I just loved the concept of people being in different groups based on like different traits. I wasn't quite as obsessed with Divergent as I was with the Hunger Games, but I just loved like I think really any dystopian world, and I loved 4. Now that I look back, the fact that 4 was named 4 because he had 4 fears is just so funny to me, but I remember reading it as a teen and being like, this is the peak of character naming, and I just thought he was so cool. There were also like unfinished movie adaptations of this series, and they were kind of sus, but my favorite thing to come out of them is like that meme of Shailene Woodley like screaming when she's like jumping off the building. I don't know why they chose to use that take, but it's provided me with great entertainment. I also remember like reading the ending of the 3rd and final book of this series. I won't spoil it for anybody who hasn't read the series yet and would like to do so, but it was so shocking. And I remember I like read the book when it came out, like the day of publication. I made my mom buy me that book, and the immediate reaction to the ending was just so wild because I honestly, now that I think about it, I think it actually was kind of a fitting ending for the series, but I just don't think we were ready for it at that time. To round out my top 3 from my like teenage years is actually Legend. I don't feel like this series was as popular as some of the other like big dystopian series like The Hunger Games, Divergent, and The Maze Runner, but I was just like really attracted to the characters in this story. I'm not exactly sure why, but it's about like this criminal boy who's like living in the slums and this like prodigy military girl, and for some reason that like clash of characters was just really doing it for me. The ending of this series, kind of similar to the Divergent series, also had my like jaw on the ground. I was like, it can't end like this. It can't. But actually, you know what? I don't know. There is no but. I still haven't gotten over it to this day. So before I talk about the honorable mentions of my favorite books of my teenage years, I feel like I have to mention the 100. I don't think I can say these were my favorite books because I didn't actually read the series. I only watched the adaptation on the CW, but I absolutely love the story. It's set in a dystopian world where Earth has been decimated by a nuclear meltdown, and the only survivors at the time were these people who were in space stations. Now, many years down the road, the space stations are running out of resources, and they want to send people down down to Earth to test if the planet is like now inhabitable again so they can return. The 100 are essentially a group of expendable teenagers. When adults commit crimes on the spaceship, they're just floated off into space to save resources, but teenagers get to wait until they're 18 where they can face trial. But they decide to send like these group of criminal teenagers down to Earth, and the story that unfolds is a really beautiful tale. It raises really interesting questions about like ethics, morality, and humanity. And yeah, it was just a really thought-provoking series that I thought was really well done. And I cried so many times during this series. There really was like no plot armor, and I think I might actually rewatch it sometime soon because now that I'm talking about it, I'm just missing it.
As for honorable mentions in my teenage years, we have Matched, Twilight, The City of Ember, The Maze Runner, The Fault in Our Stars, Delirium, Maximum Ride, and of course the Shadowhunters series.
I realized I forgot to mention The Host in my honorable mentions reel, but that was also a book I really liked. And that is all for my teenage years now. Let's go on to the present. So I'm starting off this segment of current favorites with The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. I actually was debating whether or not I wanted to include this in my favorites list because I wouldn't necessarily say it's like one of my favorite books currently, but it is the book that got me back into reading after college, so I feel like it deserves a spot in this video. Quick backstory. So when I was talking about like my favorite books in my teenage years, I was really talking about like pre-teens, like pre-high school, because by the time I got into high school, I was very much like racehorse with blinders on. I had a college that I really wanted to get into, and my parents and I pretty much decided that like anything that wasn't going on a resume was cut. So that included reading. I was very lucky to have gotten into that college, but by the time I actually was in college, I was definitely in like the bottom 10% of intelligence at that school. So I was really struggling to keep up, and then had no like time or energy to read because every free moment I had, I was trying to keep up with my classes and with my peers. But anyways, after college, I was just like scrolling up BookTok one day from like my personal account, and I came across a video about The Song of Achilles, and it just really reminded me of how much I had loved like Percy Jackson and Greek mythology growing up. And I was like, you know, now that I have some more time after college, maybe it's time to pick reading back up again. So I went to the bookstore, picked up a copy of The Song of Achilles, read it in one sitting. I think I sat down at like 5 p.m. on a Friday night and I finished it without getting up for anything. And that was the start. I just got right back into reading after it. It's about like two and a half years ago. So I've been constantly reading since. But anyways, back to The Song of Achilles. So The Song of Achilles is a retelling of the myth of Achilles, but written from the perspective of his lover Patroclus. This is just such a beautifully written book. I'm obsessed with Madeline Miller's prose. It flows so lyrically. It's almost like you're reading a ballad. And I am someone who almost kind of likes like the impending doom of reading a story in which you know that the ending is going to be tragic for. And even though I knew what was coming because I know how the myth of Achilles goes, I was still crying at the end of this because the language is just crafted so beautifully and it's just so touching the way that it was written. And I will read whatever Madeline Miller writes. I'm a huge fan of her writing style and very grateful that this book brought me back into the world of reading after college. Also, just wanted to add, I actually have 5 editions of this book. I don't know why I have all of them. I think it's just something very sentimental to me about the fact that this book brought me back into reading. Another favorite is the Poppy War trilogy by R.F. Kuang. Now this is a grimdark military fantasy inspired by the events of 20th century China. It mixes those historical events with gods and monsters and magic, specifically elemental magic, and it explores the brutal consequences of war and colonization. This makes my favorite list because I love epic fantasies. I also love the grimdark genre, which is just like a darker subgenre of fantasy. These books were so meticulously researched. You could really tell how much effort went into the research and the details, and I absolutely loved reading the battle sequence and political strategies. And the story arc itself, like the characters themselves, just really also have my heart. It's so heartbreaking. There's also a novella. It's not a printed book, by the way, but you should read it if you read this series. It's called The Drowning Faith. I think that actually might be my favorite installment out of the series. It's just from the perspective of Noja, who's like a separate character in the series, but yeah, you have to read it. Anyways, the Poppy War series really just did have like everything I was looking for in a good fantasy series. You know, we had very detailed magic and world building, flawed and realistic characters, and we had a story that just really packed an emotional punch punch, especially the ending of the third book. The ending of book 3 is so tough, but it just rounds out the story so well, and I don't really think there was any other way that the story could have ended. If you're looking for a good fantasy series to read, I would recommend this one, but I would recommend checking the trigger warnings because, like I did mention, this is quite a dark series, and I know some people have been caught off guard, so just don't want you to be someone who's caught off guard. The Secret History is another favorite of mine. Now, this was not the first Dark Academia book I read, but it is my favorite. I love Donna Tartt, and I think what really drew me to this book is the cast of characters. Now, they're not supposed to be likable. They're all very flawed. They have kind of their own distorted ways of seeing the world, and they all have their own selfish desires, but I kind of saw a lot of my flaws reflected in the flaws of the main character, Richard, particularly the morbid longing for the picturesque at all costs. And it's just really cool to see that being dissected throughout the story and seeing how that impacts the people around him and himself. And like the Song of Achilles, there are so many lines in this book that have stuck with me. And I just think if you're gonna read Dark Academia, you have to read The Secret History. It is the blueprint. Piranesi is a book I've been recommending a lot recently. This is just unlike anything I've ever read. I think the best way to go into this is completely blind, so I won't tell you anything about the plot. I honestly couldn't even if I wanted to because there's really no way to describe it. But this book has writing so atmospheric that it really establishes you in a completely different reality entirely, and you forget you're reading. The ending of this book, oh my god, the ending of this book had me just staring at a wall. I was questioning everything I knew in life. I was mind blown, and I was definitely going down some rabbit holes on Reddit looking at theories and just reading other people's thoughts, and I just think this is such a thought-provoking read. If you're someone who really likes like structured plot points and a very clear beginning, middle, and end, maybe this wouldn't be the book for you, but if you're someone who likes kind of those meandering plots and lyrical prose, you should really check out Piranesi. It also reminded me a lot of my favorite movie of all time, which is Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth. So if you've seen that movie, this book kind of has a lot of similar themes and a lot of similar vibes. And last but certainly not least, we have Circe by Madeline Miller. This is a Greek mythology retelling of the sorceress Circe, who's infamous from the Odyssey. So I read this book at a point in my life where I think I really needed to go on this journey of growth and discovery with Circe. It actually really helped me shape my own sense of self during that period of time, and for that I'm very grateful. And I think that's something that's so incredible about books and stories, is that on the surface, like, what do I have in common with Circe? Like, nothing. But when I was reading it, I really felt a lot of my own story echoed in Circe's trials and tribulations, and it was just a really like intimate and therapeutic process to read this book. It's got such lyrical prose. I'm obsessed with Madeline Miller's writing style, like so obsessed. I know I mentioned it when I was talking about the Song of Achilles, but I'm just hammering that home. I think this is actually my favorite book of all time currently, just because of how much of an impact it had on my personal life. Like, this book gave me the courage to switch industries, but this book just made me believe that I could set out on my own path and choose to pursue my own passions. So I think that's pretty incredible.
Honorable mentions for my current favorites include The Paper Menagerie, which is my favorite short story, If We Were Villains, The Myth of Sisyphus, The Sword of Kaigan, and Strange the Dreamer, which is my favorite duology.
But those are all of my favorite books. Hopefully that was a good way to introduce myself on here and you have some sense of who I am. I'm so excited to be here. I've actually been on BookTok now for almost a year, and I also have like another YouTube channel where I make book playlists. So if you only want to listen to music inspired by books and not to me talking, you should go check that out. I had so many ideas for like long form videos and for a lot of like research and book recs, and I just felt like YouTube would be the best platform on which I could make that content. Like I said, very excited to be here. Hopefully we'll all get to talk about a lot of our favorite stories and some other great books together.